Shalom. I greet you all. I'm glad to see everyone and welcome to our history course, After the Flame. Today we're going to have a wonderful lesson and all week we'll be exploring amazing things together. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the like button, and click the bell. Donations are welcome. If you have any questions, write them here in the comments and we can discuss them with you as well. We'll go through them together. Today we're talking about the diaspora, who, where, and why. We'll show a map of the dispersion. Once again, we'll recall everything we've discussed with you this week. Also, tomorrow we'll be talking about refugees and the beginning of the center in Yavne. Everyone knows what Jerusalem is. Everyone knows what the Jerusalem temple is. Everyone knows what Bethlehem is. Everyone knows what Nazareth is, but no one has ever heard of Yavne. And yet, Yavne holds tremendous significance. Yavne has enormous historical significance for us, for history, and for the entire story of how Israel was preserved. We will also look at Rabban Gamliel, who was in Yavne during the restoration of the Sanhedrin. The Roman authorities gave permission to restore the work of the Sanhedrin, that is, the Jewish court, which in fact was essential for governing the state. This week, we will also talk about the beginning of the canonization of the oral tradition. This is the most crucial factor in preserving the teachings because so many rabbis and so many sages perished. There was a hunt for the rabbis of Israel, a hunt for teachers. Torah scrolls were being destroyed, and so the decision was made to canonize the oral tradition. That is what we know in the future about the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Talmuds, and various other things. Everyone has heard the names, but no one really understands what they mean or where they come from. We'll also talk about what has actually been preserved and how to celebrate various holidays now, like Shabbat without the temple or Passover without the sacrifice, and so on and so forth. All these things were connected to our history. Up until now, before you listen and understand what we're talking about, many of you probably haven't even thought about this, maybe never even considered it at all. So as not to get ahead of ourselves, let's continue and start our topic. Our topic today is very interesting, and we definitely need to move forward. So, last week, we went through one of the most tragic moments together. Today, as always, I'll be showing you various slides. That way, you'll be able to understand everything we're talking about today. If you have any questions, feel free to write them. So, last week we went through one of the most tragic moments in the history of Israel. One of them, but not the only one. This is the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. We read together the testimony of Josephus Flavius, and in our minds we stood by the walls of the burning city of Jerusalem. Irvin, thank you. Shalom, thank you. We stood in our minds by the walls of burning Jerusalem and wondered, what will happen now? And how are we going to live now? How will the entire Jewish world live now when it always gathered for the holidays? 3 times for the pilgrimage festivals written in the Torah, everyone would always come together in Jerusalem and at the temple. Where do we go now? So now what should we do? The very core, the very foundation of existence has been destroyed. What are we supposed to do now? But in reality, there's no bad without some good. And of course, we'll talk about all of this and about how, in fact, the Creator used all these truly incredible trials and amazing things to create something absolutely astonishing and truly remarkable. We talked with you about spiritual collapse. We looked together at the beauty of the Second Temple, its magnificence, and truly, it was one of the wonders of the world. Herod's temple was truly magnificent. It rose as high as a 15-story building. And it was a huge complex with a vast number of all sorts of inner chambers. The temple itself was simple. It didn't have any spires or anything like that. Everything was square and flat. The temple was designed so that it wouldn't particularly impress anyone. You see what I mean? It wasn't like the pagan temples that amazed people with their grand architecture. In fact, the architecture was very boxy. So, if you look at the Jerusalem temple, the architecture was simple. There were right angles, flat corners, a flat roof with no elevations, so that all the glory would go only to the Creator, not to the temple. And so that, God forbid, no one would ever get the idea, for example, to worship the temple itself. We've talked about these things, about how the temple was destroyed, about the spiritual crater, about the theological question that arises before Judaism and also arises before the early Messianic movement, which is also present. Essentially, it's at the core of Judaism and the Jewish path. So how do you go on living without the temple? After all, the disciples of Yeshua and all the Jewish people who believed in Yeshua also went to the temple, and the temple was important to them as well. But a lot started to be rethought, a lot began to be reshaped into a new understanding. That's why today we are taking the first step after this catastrophe. And our lesson is dedicated to the Exodus of Dispersion, which became the fate of the Jewish people. Today we will talk about the diaspora, but not just about the diaspora as a phenomenon in human history. We will talk about who these people were, the Jews who fled from the ruin where they went and where their new home was. Most importantly, what was their goal? Was it simply to survive, or was there something more? Today, we will try to create a living map of the dispersion to understand how the future was born from the ashes of tragedy. And in general, we need to understand what the diaspora is. After all, the diaspora still holds great significance today. While I'm just switching a few things around, I just really want you to see this. Of course, we need to clarify something right away. We need to clear up one point immediately. The diaspora, that is, the life of Jews outside the land of Israel, did not begin in the year 70. The diaspora is actually quite an old phenomenon. Historians believe that by the middle of the first century, there were between 4.5 and 7 million Jews living within the Roman Empire. Not living in Israel, but throughout the entire territory of the Roman Empire. By the middle of the first century. That's truly a huge and significant portion of the population. Hundreds of years before the destruction of the temple, large and prosperous communities already existed all over the world. They were already there simply because Jews were there. Basically, even in Egypt, but at that time there was no Egypt as we think of it today. Back then, it was all Roman territory. For example, in the territory of Alexandria, or in Egypt as a whole, there were millions of Jews. By some estimates, about 1 million lived in Egypt. In Babylon, throughout all of Babylonia outside the Roman Empire, there was about another 1 million. So that's a huge number. Actually, you might think 1 million isn't much today, basically. We have cities with populations in the millions, but overall, for Israel, those are huge numbers. Today, 2,000 years later, there are, well, maybe 8 million Jews living in Israel. That's all. So these were powerful demographic centers. To understand this, we need to recall everything that happened in Persia, which at that time was Babylonia, and later would become Iran. We can recall Philo of Alexandria, the great Jewish philosopher who lived in Egypt. So what's the difference? What has changed over the last 70 years? What changed after the year 70? What changed? Everything changed. Menorah finally wrote a new historical spiritual lesson. Yes, yes, salam, salam to everyone. Everything changed, my friends. Before the year 70, all these scattered communities had a single unbreakable center: Jerusalem and the temple. The temple was the heart of the Jewish people. 3 times a year, people made pilgrimages there, sent temple taxes there, and all prayers were directed there. The temple guaranteed covenant God and Israel. After year 70, this heart torn out by roots. The diaspora that followed the destruction was fundamentally different. It was no longer an economic migration as it had been before. It wasn't even a voluntary emigration. It was a real flight for survival. Today, many people from Ukraine are also forced to flee, and millions are abroad. This is not voluntary emigration. This is a forced escape from war. Today, in the 21st century, all of this hasn't ended. It still goes on. Fleeing from the sword, from fire, fleeing from slavery. The new diaspora was made up of refugees who had lost not just their home. They didn't just lose their home, they lost the spiritual center of the universe, of their world, of their universe. Their scattering was not just geographical, but existential. The question was not just about where to live, but how to go on living as God's people when the place of their dwelling on earth has been destroyed. A huge number of Christians don't even think about this. But only people who are able to survive war can imagine just how terrible it is. But even when people manage to survive war, many adapt to new places and never return again. Many people were probably even glad for the opportunity to go somewhere else. Before, there was no chance to leave, but now such an opportunity has appeared. Maybe there are people like that too, I don't know. But for the Jews, the question was not just about where to live, or where it would be better to live or work or get rich. Now the question was much more fundamental, existential. How should God's people live when the place of their worship has been destroyed? We can simply look at the faces of the people who were present there. Yes, indeed, yes, it was mono. Klaus, specifically Klaus, and also Dubrovin, and then, of course, Shalom Shalom, a very warm and heartfelt greeting extended to everyone present in this gathering, a truly welcoming salutation. Just look closely at these faces, at who is in this crowd, who these people are. These were simple peasants, craftsmen, merchants from Jerusalem and other destroyed cities of Israel. These were people who had seen their families killed, their homes burned, their lands taken. As I mentioned before, their lands had already been seized, and they became tenants on their own land. Their first and only goal was simply to survive. The first goal was to find a safe place. Josephus Flavius writes that the Romans took captive almost 100,000 of the finest young Jews, whom they could use for forced labor in Egypt. And the strongest and most beautiful young men and women they paraded in chains during Emperor Titus's triumph in Rome. That's why I already showed you the famous bas-relief on the second arch of Titus, which depicts the captured temple menorah, which essentially became a symbol of their shame and slavery. And the menorah, in turn, became the emblem of Israel. These people became slaves throughout the empire. Those who weren't killed tried to flee further. They and their descendants formed new communities or joined already existing Jewish communities. But the most interesting and most important thing is that over the entire Jewish world living in the territory of Rome, and this was a vast area including all of Europe, all of Turkey, and huge countries, today's Africa, all the Jewish communities that were there were attacked because the Jews themselves had been declared outlaws. Now they were a defeated people who had been conquered. Thus, they were declared a rebellious people, a people rising up against Caesar. Time passed, generations passed, people no longer remember, and people Israel forgotten. Basically, in essence, there is no open wound here like there is, for example, with the Holocaust. The Holocaust still lives within us. There are still people who walk around with numbers tattooed on their arms. But a huge amount of time has already passed since those events. But if it had happened recently, it would have been a tragedy beyond words. Still, people found the strength within themselves. They found the strength to keep building communities. They found the strength to move forward. Our entire and extensive history, our whole and complete course, and everything we say and will continue to say is profoundly about this inherent strength, how the Almighty Creator consistently supported the people of Israel throughout their journey, and how we made it to this very day. Of course, not everyone did. The rebels perished. Many zealots did not perish. Those who escaped and survived scattered across different lands, carrying with them their hatred for Rome. The hatred was terrible, and perhaps also hope, and perhaps also the desire for revenge, which would later erupt in the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba, which we will also extensively discuss later, that significant event will be in the year 135. Right now, we're primarily talking about the situation immediately after the year 70. Now we are indeed discussing the most terrifying and, in general, the most profoundly difficult period. The sages, scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees, with the destruction of the temple, practically ceased to exist as a movement. What was this movement? It was the priestly elite who were closely tied to the temple itself. It was a kind of sect. They did not believe. They were like Gnostics, only of Jewish origin. There was a lot they didn't believe in, a lot they accepted, but their trace has vanished. History is silent about their development. It is quite possible that they disappeared as a path. But the Pharisees, sages, and scribes have survived to this day. They are not called Pharisees today, but wise men and scribes do exist. Sufrim ve'ahamim. We will talk about all these people throughout our course. And this is the most important group for our future. Pharisaic leaders, such as Pushim, such as the rabbis, Yakin ben Zakkai, they understood that the physical destruction of the temple should not mean spiritual death, because we also lived without the first temple. There were such times. They managed to escape from the besieged city and obtain permission from the Romans to establish an academy in Yavne. That's why the academy in Yavne plays such an important role for us. They didn't take swords with them. No one needed swords. They took Torah scrolls with them. Their goal was not to save the body. Their goal was to save the soul of the people. What is the soul of the people? It's the Torah. Without the Torah, no Jews. Without the Torah, no Israel. Without the Torah, there will be no Hebrew. Without the Torah, there will be no God. The only people who preserve the truth about God are this people, Israel. All the other nations have distorted this understanding of God, turning it into some kind of mix between paganism and the biblical God. So much so that this God is now unrecognizable. The only people who keep, the only nation that preserves this truth is this people, Israel. That's why the goal was not just to save the body, but to save the soul of the people. The Romans knew this, they understood it, and they aimed to destroy the scrolls, the Torah. The sages were being destroyed. There was a hunt for rabbis, for teachers, and there were fewer and fewer people who knew the oral tradition, who understood and knew the oral Torah, the so-called Torah Shebial Peh, which could not be precisely written down. It always had to be carefully passed orally from one esteemed teacher to another, because the process of canonization is a matter of inherent inevitability, not a mere necessity, especially since this profound knowledge was originally transmitted orally, then subsequently transformed, beautifully embellished, and significantly expanded over time. But what happened to the Messianic Jews, who were also Jews, who believed that the Messiah had already come? What happened to them, to that community that was in Jerusalem? There is a tradition that they fled to Petra. Such a tradition exists. I don't quite agree with this tradition. It's a Christian tradition, and I don't fully agree with it. I think that they defended and fought, and many of them died, but many of them fled. And what happened to them? They also, unfortunately, became refugees. Their subsequent dispersion followed its own distinct and challenging path as well. At that time, there was no Christianity yet, so they couldn't say, "Excuse us, we're no longer Jews, we're Christians now, don't persecute us." They were just as much Jews as everyone else, Hebrews, and they were persecuted just like all those who didn't believe in Yeshua. By that time, already by the year 70, after the death of the apostles, there were still large centers remaining in Antioch and in various other places. Gradually, these important centers were moving further inland, meaning the Jewish population and their communities The leaders were dying, and more they were being replaced by non-Jews, that is, Gentiles, who gradually began to introduce their own ways. Pagan practices. We'll talk about this as well. There's nothing complicated about it, but all of them were monotheists. There were no Trinitarians among them, no doctrines about triads, gods, or anything like that. Came into being, and then for centuries later, it no longer existed. They were all monotheists. They all believed in the one creator. They all saw the Mashiach first and foremost as a human being, even if they recognized divine qualities in him, which he does have, and saw in him a divine calling, which is also there, and saw in him a divine purpose. Of course, there is. But they did not see in him pre-existence, for example, that he existed at some point in the past. He existed in concept, not physically. In God's plan, the Mashiach has always existed. That's it. They were monotheists. They believed in the one creator. They developed their own theories about things. But at some point, they diverged, especially after the year 135, when many Jews in Israel proclaimed Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. At that time, the Messianic community said, no, our Mashiach is Yeshua. We cannot accept Bar Kokhba, but that's not even the main point. You can accept any Mashiach you want, not the issue. The main thing you accept the Torah. The main thing you accept a monotheist. Throughout the history of the people of Israel, there have been many different messiahs. That didn't stop Jews from being Jews, and they didn't kill each other over it. They split into different factions, but still they remained one people. But the division happened precisely because the Jews followed the Torah, as always, and followed the Creator. It was the Greek bishops who began to teach and profess other ideas and completely different principles. And gradually, Gnosticism and various Greek philosophical ideas gained the upper hand. We will talk about this as well, my friends. There is nothing hidden about it today. Today, all processes and all things are absolutely open. This division also happened gradually. It did not happen all at once. Now let's look at the routes. The routes are also very important for us. Look at this map, and it will become clear to you that the main direction is Babylonia. That is, it's the east. The east is the main direction. That is all of Babylonia, Greater Babylonia. Today, this area is divided into many different countries, but back then it was all considered Greater Babylonia. At that time, there was already a large, autonomous, and wealthy Jewish community there. Its population, as I mentioned, reached about 1 million people, which by the standards of that time was truly a very large scale. There were states and countries that had even fewer than 1 million people, and yet they were still considered states. Secondly, and this is critically important, Babylonia was located outside the borders of the Roman Empire. It was under the rule of the Parthians. There were also wars between the Parthians and Rome. But at the very least, Babylonia was free from that machine, the iron machine of Rome. And generally speaking, for the Jews, it was quite a safe place. It was precisely the Babylonian community that, in the following centuries, would become the main center of Jewish scholarship and where, essentially, the Babylonian Talmud would be written. And this was a strategic choice. The Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud were written by different people at different times. And the people who wrote them did not compare their texts with each other. But when these Talmuds were finally compared, when they were brought together and it became clear that, in fact, both the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds are essentially one, it turned out that there really aren't any major disagreements. This says a lot. It shows that there was a centralization in the understanding of truth, which was passed down through the oral tradition from mouth to mouth. The oral tradition was that strong. Oral tradition was considered the highest form of knowledge transmission. Now we can look at the Roman Empire, Antioch, Alexandria, the cities in Asia Minor. I really do think that this particular map here will probably help us out quite a bit. Here we can see all of this. All the arrows that go to the left, not to the right. Syrian Antioch was the third largest city in the empire with a very large Jewish community. And there were interesting things in Antioch as well. There were also Messianic Jews there, and quite a few of them. This is what we read about in the Acts of the Apostles. I think it's chapter 12. It was Antioch that became an important center for both Judaism and Christianity. Basically, this whole area, the cities of Asia Minor, that is, the entire territory of modern-day Turkey, was where the Apostle Paul had previously established his communities. And these communities also took in a huge number of refugees from Israel. After all, during their lifetimes, they were constantly collecting donations for Jerusalem. That's the north. Now, if we look to the south, we'll see Egypt. Let me show you another map where we can see Egypt. Egypt is located, just a second, let's look right here. Yes, Egypt is at the bottom, you'll see it. And as we discussed, about 1 million Jews lived here. And of course, the center of Egypt was the beautiful Roman Alexandria. In Alexandria, Jews made up as much as 40% of the population. That's hundreds of thousands of people. Just think about it. 40% of the population of Alexandria, the central city, that's an incredible number. That's probably more than in Jerusalem before the war. I mean, 40%. But relations with the Greek population were very tense. And after the year 70, of course, this tension only grew because anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, all of that just went through the roof. The Romans imposed a humiliating tax on the Jews, the fiscus Judaicus. The tax that used to go to the temple in Jerusalem, now they were forced to pay it to the temple of Jupiter, to Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome. It was a daily reminder of their defeat. They had to offer their money to the temple of Jupiter. In other words, in doing so, they were essentially participating in supporting these idols. But thank God for the Torah, and our Torah laws say that any action that is forced or done under compulsion is not considered a true action. Maybe we can also see the West here. This is Rome and Europe. As we mentioned earlier, thousands of Jews ended up in Rome as slaves. Over time, they and their descendants gained their freedom, creating a strong community in the very heart of the empire. From there, Jewish communities gradually spread further west, to Gaul, which is France, and to Spain. So what do we have as a result? Those people who stayed in Israel, and they were the minority, founded an academy in Jabna, a center in Jabna, which we will talk about next time. Babylon took in almost 1 million Jews, Egypt at that time nearly 1 million, Alexandria, Syria, Antioch, and Rome. There were also huge Jewish centers there. So by the end of the first century, the Jewish world was scattered across a vast territory. But gradually, out of the depths of chaos, new centers, new forces, and centers of thought began to emerge. These centers are actually of great importance to us. We will be studying these particular centers in detail. Now, give me a minute. It is these centers that we will be talking about. They are, for us, truly the fundamental essence of thoroughly studying this entire and comprehensive course. We will analyze their lives, what they lived for and what they did, what their goals were. Did they just want to survive, to find a piece of bread, a roof over their heads? Their main goal was to preserve the Torah, to maintain their identity, to remain the people of the covenant without a temple, without sacrifices, without priesthood, and even without the land of Israel. To establish schools in order to educate children. To set up markets so that kosher slaughter could take place, to establish their own centers. These centers were subjected to persecution, destruction, and expulsions. We will study all of this together and take a closer look. The first center in Israel was, of course, the center in Jabna. That's why the sages gathered in Jabna. It's a small town in the south of Israel, well, between the south and the center, let's put it that way. And they gave their answer, saying, "They took the temple from us, but we still have the Torah." That's why the center of religious life shifted from sacrifices to prayer, to the study of Scripture, and to the observance of commandments. A person himself became the temple, and the prayers themselves became the sacrifices, offered 3 times a day, just like the sacrifices used to be. The ritual washing of hands, Netalat Yadayim, turned into the washing of the priest's hands, who used to wash their hands, and various other commandments and practices were also introduced so that the temple would continue to exist in a metaphysical space, now within our actions and in our hearts. Now, it's as if the temple has relocated into our very being. And now every Beit Midrash, every house of study, became a small temple where the most important thing was to preserve the heritage. The synagogue eventually came to be widely called a Mikdash Mi'at, that is to say, a small sanctuary, a little temple, a sacred place of worship. That's why, if you enter a synagogue, you'll see the Torah taken from the Aron Kodesh, symbolizing the Holy of Holies. Everything about how a synagogue is arranged is set up according to the principles of the temple itself, whether small or large. That's why the idea was to build a fence, to build another layer of protection around the Torah itself, which would allow the people to survive under any circumstances. And this protective fence was essential. That's why, let's say, a huge number of other various commandments were established. You might say that these commandments were invented by people. My friends, the socks you wear were also invented by people. The shampoo you use to wash your hair was invented by people too. And the fork you eat with was also invented by people. But not everything that people come up with is bad if it helps you live. The thing is that in the Christian worldview, everything people do is, by definition, wrong. You are wrong. It all depends on what kind of people do it and with what desire and motivation people do this or that. What they do depends on this. It is either valuable or priceless. So here it is. Everything that was created, all the fences that were built around the Torah, they didn't appear by accident. If they hadn't existed, Jews would have simply assimilated, just assimilated in the diaspora. They would have just become Catholics and stopped being Jews. Which in principle would have been equivalent and tantamount to simply destroying everything. There would be no Jews, no Israel, and nothing at all. There wouldn't even be God, because God exists and is sustained by Israel. As strange as that may seem to you, that's exactly how it is, because God himself called himself the God of the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If this family were to disappear, there would be no understanding or knowledge of the Creator. That's why a barrier was created, which allowed the Jews to remain isolated from the surrounding world. And in this, so to speak, rather general and widespread isolation, they were indeed able to successfully survive and endure. Today, when you look at it, it might seem amusing to you, sometimes even funny. You might see Jews walking around in certain hats, black clothes, and some kind of stockings. You see all these Jews, and you can't understand why they dress like that and what's going on with them, why exactly like that. You can't understand it because you don't know the history, you don't understand how these people survived. You don't understand what allowed them to preserve themselves, why they just don't walk around in jeans, shorts, and flip-flops. There's something we truly don't understand. And my primary task is to gradually shed more light on all these intricate things. Messianic Jews also developed in their own truly unique and distinct way. So, little by little, they slowly migrated. That is to say, Messianism was gradually and progressively forgotten. Break time equals 0.5s forward slash. The Antioch community lost to the Alexandrian one, and Alexandrian orthodoxy prevailed at the Council of Nicaea. Everyone, um, um, everyone who believed in the one Creator was subjected to anathema, heresy, persecution, and even destruction. We will go through all of this together as we move forward. And it's very important to realize all of this. That's why everything that happened did not happen by chance. All of this marked the end of the old world and the beginning of a new one. In this scattering, in the struggle for survival, two forces were forged. They truly were forged. And these forces defined the entire Western civilization. The first force is Rabbinic Judaism, which, in my opinion, is an excellent tool for the survival of Jews in the diaspora, but is not quite suitable for life in Israel. In the diaspora, it is a wonderful tool, but in Israel, it doesn't fit. In Israel, there should be a different reality. And this is what Abraham Kook was developing at the beginning of the 19th century, when he began to truly shape the Zionist movement. Today, this movement is gaining strength and momentum with each passing day and year. The church knows nothing about this either. And basically, without the Zionist movement, there wouldn't be the Israel we have today. There simply wouldn't be. Alongside Rabbinic Judaism, Christianity was born. It's as if they both emerged from the same ashes. They fought for the same soul of the people, but went down completely different paths. Completely different paths. The Jews remained faithful to the Torah. They developed their tradition, continued to teach people everything they knew, and remained monotheists and adherents of the idea of a single creator. Christians, on the other hand, shifted to Greek philosophy, blending Jewish interpretations of the New Testament scrolls with their own Greek ideology. That's why concepts like the logos and various other ideas were born, which replaced Jewish concepts and the understanding of the meanings of Hebrew, the Torah, and the commandments. Gradually, Christian orthodoxy emerges, which no longer has anything in common with the Jewish path. And the Christian faith, which believed in the one Creator and in the Messiah whom he sent, this path was declared illegal. We will also get to these things together, and we will gradually move forward step by step. In any case, it is important for us to understand the history of Christianity can be studied. There are lectures, there are a huge number of courses on this history. All the various divisions, all the established orthodoxy, all the numerous councils, all the extensive debates, and so on, all the significant battles that took place. I simply cannot go into all the intricate details and specific nuances because my primary focus is indeed Israel. I want to trace specifically this line, how the Jews were preserved, how they survived, and how they developed not only within paganism, but later within Christianity as well, and how they managed to endure despite Christianity's constant attempts to convert them. My friends, in any case, thank you for joining our lessons. If you have any questions about today's topic, leave them in the comments below this video, and I'll do my best to answer them. We'll also see each other tomorrow and continue our topic.